Welcome to another edition of Living Justice, Living Leadership. I'm your host, Lee Fisher, the Dean of Cleveland State University College of Law, and we regularly interview leaders who have made an impact on the world in different ways. And today I have the privilege and honor and pleasure of interviewing somebody that I've known for, I think probably decades, let's put it that, at least since the time that we were in high school together. I didn't know him well, but he was, I think, 1 year ahead of me in high school, and we've known each other for a long time, and we've been friends for a long time. But that doesn't mean that I'll just give him softball questions. I'll give him some tough questions. Don't worry. This is somebody who I've admired for a long time, and he recently wrote a book, and you can see it in the bottom of my screen, The Soul of the Deal, written by Marc Morgenstern. Marc, welcome.
Thank you so much for that very gracious and overly positive introduction.
It'll continue to be positive, I promise. I think the listeners and the watchers, because we do this both on audio and in video, want to know a little bit about you before we talk about what you believe and what you've written about in your fascinating book. So let's talk a little bit about your life. Let's actually even begin where you were born, where you grew up, where you went to school. Let's go with that.
Okay, so I've never grown up. I'd like to put that on the record early.
I like that. Okay.
I was born in Cleveland, Ohio at University Hospitals. I went to Shaker Schools. I went to Yale. I went to BU Law School. And after that, depending on whether you're asking my wife, Amy, or me, I think I've had an eclectic career. She thinks I've had an unfocused career. So potatoes.
Well, I would say it's eclectic, and that's actually reflected in your book because it's a combination not just of law and business, it also includes music and entrepreneurship, and it's all woven into one common theme, and that is the soul of a deal. Let's talk a little bit about the fact that you began your business career doing something that nobody does today. It's called selling encyclopedias. How did you begin doing that?
Literally, I responded to an ad, and you're right, and it doesn't happen today. It was more to the point, it was door to door, right? You got dropped in a strange place hundreds of miles from here. You didn't know where it was. You got dropped off. There were no cell phones. You were supposed to meet there at the end of the day and get picked up. And in between, you were supposed to sell encyclopedias to people who weren't looking to buy them and didn't want them.
Tough task.
And there are several things about it that were incredibly important. One is that every human being is different, and the people in every house were different, and the dynamics in every house were different. And one person went on an encyclopedia because they didn't graduate from high school and they wanted their kids to have an education. And someone might want an encyclopedia because it made their living room look better. It was a decorative piece. It was still just an encyclopedia. It's the size that it is, it's the weight that it is. But you could sell it different ways depending upon how the person you were selling it to wanted to buy it. And that concept of the first thing you do in selling is find out what the buyer wants to buy, and then you sell that to them.
Yes.
That's pretty fundamental. The second lesson is, if you've ever, you didn't sell encyclopedias door to door, but let me just say the rough industry statistics are, if you knock on 100 doors and you're really, really good, you'll get into 5 or 6 maximum. If you get into 5 or 6 and you're really, really good, you'll sell 1. And the converse of that is you're going to hear no at least 99 times out of 100, and you're still going to go to the next door. And that's a lesson that many people, including lawyers, don't like to hear no. And so they don't like to sell because they take no personally. And there's nothing personal about it. And when I heard no, all I thought was, okay, well, I'm engaged in a conversation. We got it started. Where do we go from no? Hey, that was nice of you to say that so politely. Can we talk just a little bit more? So selling encyclopedias, you learn tons of lessons about people. You saw people you'd never experienced any other way. And you learn to appreciate the dynamics of a closing, which is that the stakeholders in that set of circumstances, and this was, remember, a long time ago, it was always a wife and a husband. That was the uniform. And what you realized was you could have one of the spouses nodding their head up and down the entire time, but the other one was the decision maker. And so you hadn't made a sale and you thought you'd made a sale. So the broad concept that you've got to identify the real decision makers in any room and who you've got to influence and what they have to be persuaded of and how can you get everybody to a yes at the same time. All of those things are inherent in selling encyclopedias. And part of what is so powerful about it is that encyclopedia selling is the most raw, unrefined kind of selling you can do. It's blunt, it's crude, it's fast, you're sort of in and out. But no matter how sophisticated negotiations and sales get for the rest of your life, they're all just extrapolations from those basic building blocks. And so it's a
Makes sense.
very easy way to learn that what motivates people to do things: fear, greed, scarcity, time pressure, doesn't change.
I would argue that besides those who sell encyclopedias and vacuum cleaners like they used to door to door, there is one other group of people who can relate to what you said, and that is people running for elected office. Because I did exactly what you're talking about for decades. I went door to door. I got lots of no's. I got lots of dogs barking. I got lots of closed doors. And
Yep,
so I completely relate to what you're saying. And one of the things that I learned, and I think you have learned this as well, is that if I did get in the door, I didn't immediately talk about myself and you didn't immediately talk about the encyclopedia. Am I right?
correct. Never. The
Right.
first thing you did, which I'm sure is the same thing you did, is what can I learn about these people before I open my mouth?
Yes.
So you look on the wall. What do they have pictures or don't they have pictures? Is there music playing? Is it Beethoven or is it the Beatles? What's cooking in the kitchen? Um, is there a newspaper? Is it a red newspaper or a blue newspaper? What's on TV? You're looking for all of the sort of environmental cues that tell you things. And in particular, you're looking for things that you and the person can agree on and extrapolate from. So as an example, if you walked into a house and you saw what is now a Cleveland Guardians pennant, great, let's talk baseball. Do you like the Guardians? Oh, yeah, I like the Guardians. Well, I do too. What do you like the best about them? And then someone's talking with you about something they want to talk about. And that's how you both break the ice and become friends with people. You find the things in common.
Even though the internet has displaced the hard copy encyclopedia, the lessons that you learned haven't changed at all. And they're just as applicable today in the day of the internet and AI as they were when you were selling encyclopedias.
They are, and I think they're also harder to learn because you have fewer environments to learn them. And if we're looking at it from a sort of narrow lawyer, law student, law firm perspective, a lot of being a lawyer is apprenticeship. No one sat down and taught you things. You were in a room and some partner was talking on a telephone and you listened, or you were in a negotiating room and somebody negotiated. And by the way, you saw characteristics and traits you really admired and wanted to emulate. And you saw characteristics and traits that made you want to cringe
Mhm.
and think, I would never do that. But none of it was teaching you. It was all observation by environment.
Yeah.
And that's just not there anymore.
The other thing is that even we are in the age of the internet. There, if we had done a podcast 15 years ago, we'd be doing this in person. And the truth is that we ought to be doing much more in person than we do today. And that's a common theme in your book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, at the end of the day, if you're a transaction lawyer, right, a lot of your audience are doing transactions, you can learn about taxes and you can learn about structures and you can learn about 3 - 2 = 1. But that's not what makes a deal or doesn't make a deal. People are what make it or don't make it.
Hmm.
And that's why the sort of one of the maxims is people, not spreadsheets, are the epicenter of every deal. So I'm not sure how else to say that any better than I just said it, though I'm sure there's a better way to say it.
Well, I think the point being that I think as we spend a lot of time helping young law students get educated about the law, I find that especially since COVID, many of them want to learn on the internet and they want to learn remotely. And we do everything we can to engage them in the building. so that they are observing and they're watching and they're getting to know each other, because the best way to get to know somebody is face to face, eye to eye. And that is clearly something you talk about in a lot of the stories in your book.
Yeah.
Let's move for a second to the book itself.
Okay.
Uh, why did you write the book? What prompted you to write the book? And let's talk about the process of writing it itself.
So, like lots of things in my life, I would attribute it to luck, serendipity, and timing. Right. So, through the years, I've given tons of speeches and presentations at MBA programs and law schools and all kinds of environments. So, lots and lots of pages and outlines and things. And one day I was thinking, well, I have all of these things. I could probably stitch them into a book. And wouldn't that be handy? And then I've sort of amortized this knowledge. So I did that. And it's 150 pages, 160 pages. It took me 2 years. And I showed it to my dad, who at the time was 94. He's now 99.
I know your father is a remarkable man.
He is indeed. And he read it. And I said, well, what do you think? And he said, well, it's brilliant. He said, no one's going to read it, but it's brilliant. I said, no one's going to read it. He said, well, it's kind of dry and the maxims are good and the stories are good. So that's what you should do. But this book is not going to sell 3 copies. So, okay, you're my father. Okay. So I wrote a second book, right? Pretty completely eliminating book number 1. And this one I sort of designed for me because I spend a lot of time on airplanes. So I designed it to be sort of modular. My dad has said maxims and stories. So there were 35 chapters, and each chapter heading was a maxim. And then there was the backstory. And I sort of thought, well, somebody could pick it up on a plane and start at chapter 20 if they like that one, or 3 or 7, or okay. So I showed it to my children. My children read it. They came back and they said, Daddy, this is brilliant. No one's going to read it, but it's brilliant. I said, what do you mean no one's going to read it? Poppy said, it's got to be stories and maxims. They said, yeah, but Dad, books like this have an arc and they have a narrative, and there isn't one. So I said, I can't believe it. So I wrote a third book, taking those things, turning it into an arc and a narrative. And I was very lucky to have I had a lot of beta readers. I had people I do business with. And I'd say, would you read this chapter? Would you read this? And they would, and they gave really good comments. And then I thought I'd finished the book, and I sent it to all of them and said, this is your last chance to say something. So here's the book. What do you want?
Can I take a guess what they told you?
Well, yes, you can guess.
Here's my guess. You're missing one thing, the takeaways.
And the answer is every business book like this has to have key takeaways at the end of every chapter.
Right, right.
I don't read business books. How would I know that? At every business. So it took me 3 more months to write the key takeaways. The book, I think, like most of life, is a mosaic of other people talking, listening, sharing, giving me feedback. And again, going back to my wife, Amy, her view is feedback is a gift. And it's a gift whether you're writing a book or you're starting a company. Marketplaces tell you things, right? So you've got to listen to marketplaces. And if you've asked smart people to give you their opinion, you should pay some attention to it.
I think there are a number of strengths in your book. You've mentioned some of them. The maximums are great. I've been hearing those maxims as long as I've known you. Probably didn't know that they were Morgenstern maxims. I just heard them. And the stories are great. In fact, storytelling to me is the key tool of communication. And the takeaways are great because we live in a society where people want to read something quickly and get a takeaway. And so you get the combination. But the thing that I think is most important about your book is that it's genuine and it brings in all aspects of your life, not just the legal aspects, not just the business aspects, but it's something that's very important to you in your life, and that is music. Talk about that.
All those years when I was doing all that teaching, and people would say, how did you learn to do what you do? My answer would be selling encyclopedias door to door and following the Grateful Dead. And I think that they thought I was being either facetious or metaphorical. And I wasn't being either. I was being quite literal. So what do you learn watching a Grateful Dead concert? And presumably all of your audience hasn't been to a Grateful Dead concert.
That's probably true.
Okay. So they're a jam band. And that means that on any given night, they might play a song for 3 minutes one night And if you saw them a week later, they might play it for 33 minutes. And it would start in one key and move to a different key. It would start in one rhythm and move to a different rhythm. Um, the only rules were there were no rules. And so the dead played to their audience and the audience played back to the dead. And because you had acoustics that were different in every venue, they would change their playing style to the acoustics of this venue. There would be crowds that loved fast songs. There would be crowds that loved slow songs. So they sort of terraformed themselves repeatedly to their audience. And then at a very visceral level of listening, how do jam band musicians listen? And other than that, if you're going to be responding to changes you're not expecting, you better be paying close attention. So have you ever wondered at a concert, you frequently find the bass player and the lead guitar and the rhythm guitarist, and they move to the middle of the stage
Yes.
and triangle, and they're looking at each other.
They're watching each other's hand usually, right?
They are
Yeah.
watching each other's hands. They're looking at their eyes. They're watching their shoulders. They want to hear more than they can hear with their ears.
I love that. Yeah.
Right. And that's one of the things you learn at the Grateful Dead is what engaged listening really means. And the reason why, and some of your audience won't like this, but I mean it respectfully, your goal is to learn to listen like a jam band musician, not like a lawyer. And here's what I mean by that, because we went through law school and you were trained to rebut or distinguish or conflate or disagree, but it was the negative. If you're trying to put a business deal together or you're a musician, you're trying to find things in common that you can build on. It's literally a 180-degree difference in how you're approaching listening. And so, if particularly in the deal world, you're not going to impose your views on somebody else. You're trying to find what deal is there to be made here. I want to listen to everything my counterparty says and hear everything they're saying. And sort of to your earlier point about being in person, I can't see them in a Zoom. I can see their head, see their eyes. I can't see the rest of them. I can't tell. I'd lose like 80% of what I value in life, which is a full viewing of another human being.
So Jerry Garcia was probably the ultimate communicator
Yeah.
because he knew how to not just play, but he knew how to listen.
Yes. And in terms of a lawyer, so people want to know, well, how do you improvise? How did the dead improvise? And they sort of think, well, you just sort of wake up one morning and say, hey, I'm a free spirit. I'm going to improvise. So here was one of the most important things I thought Garcia ever said. When he's around 40 and now, like the world's best guitarist, recognized consistently. And someone said, do you have any regrets? He said, yes, I regret that I didn't do more scale work.
What's
Now,
that mean?
think about that. That's sort of like when LeBron
Practice.
James, you have to master your craft.
Yeah.
You can't improvise. You can't do creative things until you know everything that would be done by convention. And then you have the freedom to act in the moment because you're not having to think about it. Think about when a basketball player, I'm just taking basketball, it's not a basketball, but there's some nights that you just know somebody is in the flow.
Yep.
Right? The basket looks like it's 10 feet wide, and they think it's 10 feet wide. And they're just in a frame where I've been practicing this for my entire life. And tonight it's all come together. And a problem we all have in negotiating is people overthink. What do they mean? How should I respond? And by the time you have to think, you're never going to give as creative an answer as if you don't have to think. And you only get to the point if you don't have to think, if you've completely mastered your craft or played the scales 27,000 times. So it's one of those really profound comments.
Speaking of basketball, two great examples of that are Kobe Bryant and LeBron James. Some people who actually practice and practice and practice and practice when some of the other stars are not in the gym.
No, and LeBron every year would go home in the summer and say, there's another skill I need to learn. And he was already the best basketball player in the world, but no, I can be better. And as long as I can be better, I should be better. And yeah, many people just sort of coast. I'm athletic enough, or I'm smart enough, or whatever it is. But good is enough. And the people who are really driven to be great know that only great is enough. And even then, it's not enough.
We teach here at the law school that as much as talent counts, effort counts twice as much. And that's also true of attitude as well. And you're right that too many law schools, in fact, our law school as well, have focused for a long time about the fact that lawyers advocate, they argue their side. But the best lawyers are the ones who actually follow Stephen Covey's rule of the 7 habits of highly effective people, and that is seek first to understand and then to be understood. And so that's why I teach a course in leadership, which tries to talk about the fact that actually sometimes the best thing you can do is to get inside the head of someone else, understand where they're coming from, and sometimes even change your mind as a result.
To me, that is like, it's not a question. That's step number one in anything, is to know your counterparty.
Yes.
Think of, I was on a negotiating call today, as you know,
Yes.
and the people have been nice enough to send me a very long thing beforehand. Before we started, I said, listen, I really appreciate this. I read it 5 times, but I'm not sure I got everything you were trying to say. Would you please talk me through the document so I make sure that I know what these words mean to you? Because I know they mean a lot to you. And several different times they talked about a word, and I said, that's not how I read it. That's really helpful. Now I
Okay.
understand what you're saying. So if you can't get behind someone's vocabulary, if you don't know something about who they are as a human being, you'll never hear them correctly. You'll hear them through your prism, not through their prism.
How did you get to the title, The Soul of the Deal?
Well, let's see. I don't actually have the whole book here, but
Well, I have it right here. Would you like
oh,
to look
how
at it?
handy. Okay. So if you look at it,
Yep.
the soul of the deal by itself is a triple word play, and I'll come back to that.
Right.
But if you
That's the
look,
deal circle here, right?
yep, and if you look underneath it, you'll see it says something like from day one to exit.
Right. DA1 to exit creative frameworks for buying, selling, and investing in any business.
Okay. So here's what we were trying to accomplish, and here's what I think we did accomplish, and here's what we didn't accomplish. I think the cover looks great. I mean, it beams out from a bookshelf.
I agree. It's great.
They did an incredible job. The from day one to exit was my attempt to say, I don't just come in and negotiate the day you're selling the business. I've usually been there since day one. And the view of a founder is different than a view of anybody else. So I tend to have a founder's view of things,
Hmm.
including why it's painful as a founder to sell things because it's your baby, right? So from day one to exit tells you something. And the creative frameworks is I am a really, really lousy rule follower. I don't like rules. I don't like to follow rules. And so many books that are out there will say the 7 secrets of something, the 3 hidden whoosies of witchies, here are well, in the real world of negotiating, nobody holds up a cue card and says it's time to apply rule number 7.
Right.
Frameworks are more of a philosophy. These are ways to think. And if you consciously embrace these as ways to think, then they will guide your actions in the moment. But they're ways to think, they're principles of thinking, they're frameworks. They are not rules.
Well, you do have some themes, though, throughout this book, in addition to the maxims. What would you say are the cornerstones of the book, the guiding themes?
Well, there are a couple different things. Let's start with what actually, to me, is the single most important thing, which uh, the public doesn't seem to perceive it the same way as I do.
Mhm.
So you know what the deal circle is, and it's hard to explain to your audience without looking at it. But in every negotiation, let's make it a purchase and sale of a business. There are concentric circles of people who are stakeholders and influencers in that. Okay, great.
Showing this to people because this is your deal circle in your book itself. You can't
So
read all the words, but that's the idea.
if you look at the inner circle, what's obvious? Well, there's a buyer and a seller, and everybody will be automatically thinking about the buyer and the seller when they're negotiating because they're right there. There isn't a deal without them. What is a little less obvious is the next concentric circle, which are lawyers and accountants and investment bankers. Even the lawyer is a pretty frequent participant. So you see the lawyer, you know it's somebody that has to be persuaded. You probably never see the accountant. You
Hmm.
probably never see the investment banker, but you know that the buyer and the seller are each relying on theirs. And so you have messages you want to communicate to people you can't see. And then you go farther out and think, well, there are employees and there are customers and there are lenders, and there's another whole circle of people that will have an influence on this decision, but you're not negotiating with them. So one of the things a friend of mine, Betsy Atkins, founded Ascend Communications and sold to Lucent a long time ago. One of Betsy's phrases was, you have to figure out how many yeses you are away from making a sale.
I like that.
So part of the deal circle is to say, you got to get yeses from all these people, and you don't even know you need to get their yes. So it's sort of a map that lets you automatically think about, is this a solution for this person? Is it a problem? Will it benefit them? Will it not benefit them? So they'll fight it. And it expands your concept of how many yeses you have to get automatically.
I remember reading a story that demonstrates that very well in your book, where I think you said that on the surface, it looked everything was going to go well because the CEO said, let's get this done. Turned out that there were some shareholders behind the scenes who said, not so quick.
And that's more the norm than not the norm. And so yes, so that's one. So the second thing that is a new concept was, to me, my major intellectual contribution to this whole discussion. I also think vocabulary is kind of stilted and too limited. So I make up lots of words because I want the word to mean, sort of like Humpty Dumpty, I want it to mean what I want it to mean. So I made up words like win in waiting. You're negotiating something and somebody says something and you can agree to that, but you don't have to agree to it now. You can just leave it aside as a win in waiting. And when you need a win, that's when you put it on the table, but it's a win in waiting. The second word is just the concept of, do you want to be a deal maker or do you want to be a deal jammer? So deal jammer to me is somebody who approaches all of these things with a musician's eyes and ears and a founder's mentality and a willingness to do a deal in lots of different ways. There's just not one way to play a song, and there's just not one way to do a deal. So it's a much more flexible, innovative, in the moment approach to deal making. So that's
the difference between a one-dimensional deal maker and a multi-dimensional deal maker.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other two things really are, most people are never in a room, whether it's a room or it's a Zoom, it doesn't matter. It's an environment in which things that involve this much money with this level of intensity, they don't ever get to see it, right? So how would they ever learn anything? And so, in Hamilton, where everybody says, I want to be in the room where it happens.
Yeah.
Well, this is sort of the same thing. You can't be in the room where it happens, but let me share with you as exactly as I can what happens in the room where it happens. So this is the dialogue. This is the back and the forth. I said this, they said that. I said this, they said that. And so you can feel the ping pong nature of the dialogue, not just a conclusion. We did this to accomplish that. No, it takes a lot of back and forth. And why did I choose this word instead of that word? Well, because this one's going to calm people down and this one's going to rile people up. So I made a very conscious choice of which adjective to use. And then just some of the stuff that's visual, which I can do here for your people who are looking at it. But in a negotiation, we've gone back and forth all day about a price. And let me forget the price and just say they wanted $20 and we wanted to offer 10. Okay, back and forth all day. And at the end, I just said, I want you to pay very close attention. And I raised my hand. So physically, how does somebody not pay attention to my raised hand? And I said, okay, this is your 20. That's not going to happen. This is 18. That's not going to happen. This is 14. That's not going to happen. This is 12. That's not going to happen. This is $10.47. That's not what's going to happen. It's $10 exactly. And the whole time I have people looking at my hand, hearing it. By the way, they don't know what my final stroke is going to be. I could say $6 because I'm fed up and I'm frustrated, but it's 10. And now instead of being angry, they're relieved. Oh, yes. Right?
Yep.
And
you've got their attention.
And I know everybody's hearing it.
Right, exactly.
If you walk back in that room and I just sit down and say, Lee, it's $10, take it or leave it. 6 or 7 words, it's the same message. three people at the table probably didn't even hear it.
Yep.
Right? They were looking a different way. They were looking at their cell phone. They were looking at their watch. They were looking at their note. They didn't, literally didn't hear it, let alone hear it in terms of engaged listening. That's one of the things you can do going back to your in-person. I can't do that on a Zoom. It would look ridiculous.
You're right. It's also, by the way, what you described is also a good rule of public speaking as well. People are sometimes told not to use their hands. That's the worst advice you can give somebody as a public speaker. You do use gestures to help them understand, to process, to provide context. And you've done that beautifully throughout your book. The $12 million negotiation is a perfect example where you used your hands and it got to the word 12 million, as I recall.
Yeah. And as a musical concept, a crescendo goes like that to build.
Mm-hmm.
I think of this as a descending crescendo, but either way, it's building, 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 adding tension, getting to an endpoint. It's a crescendo.
Well, I think we should focus a little bit on the maxims. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read you one of your maxims and ask you to tell me an example or a story that demonstrates it. And
Okay.
let's begin with the maxim that is my favorite, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's your favorite too, because I've actually heard this maxim not just from Marc Morgenstern, but from his wife, Amy Morgenstern. And that is, an expectation unarticulated is a disappointment guaranteed. And I, by the way, have copied that phrase as recently as last week when I was meeting with my staff.
Okay. Good on you. Hopefully with
Mhm.
attribution. So I would tell you that that is actually everybody's favorite one. And I think it's because it applies in every aspect of life. So when you're a kid and you do something and your mom or your dad says, you're not supposed to do that. And the kid says, well, I didn't know that. Okay, well, no one ever told them that they weren't supposed to do that. So it was an expectation. It was unarticulated.
Yes.
You start working in a law firm and somebody gives you an assignment. And 3 hours later, the partner comes and says, well, is it done? And you say, well, I was going to do it tomorrow. Well, I needed it today. Well, you didn't tell me that. How would I know that? So you had an expectation, you didn't articulate it, and now you're disappointed. But that's not on me, that's on you.
Yeah.
And if you did it in terms of a negotiation, and a pretty easy example is you've finished a session and somebody says, I'll get you the document back tomorrow. Okay. And everybody leaves. Great. I don't leave. What I say is, okay, well, I'm on the East Coast, you're on the West Coast. So let's start with what we mean by tomorrow.
Mhm.
And did you mean 8 a.m. Pacific? Did you mean noon EDT? Did you mean 6? When you said tomorrow, what does it mean? And I'll tell you, going all the way back to when I did, for many years, I did a lot of work in Venezuela and Panama and Colombia and South America generally. And we'd be working, and then everybody would say mañana. And I'm from Cleveland. I'm expecting mañana to be 8 o'clock the next morning. They're going to pick me up because they said we're going to start working again. No, at 10:30 they'd say, call and say, let's go to breakfast. And I'd say, well, when are we going to start working? Mark, just lighten up. We'll get there. And every day would be mañana. So it's literally true that people use the same word. They mean completely different things. Everybody thinks they've articulated their expectation and nobody has.
I love that one.
Right.
Let's talk about another one that you talk about quite frequently, and that is the seller's mantra is certainty and confidentiality.
So we're talking specifically about the seller of a business. So the
Okay.
context here matters quite a lot. And this is a combination of psychology and practicality both. So a potential buyer says to a potential seller, they hardly ever say, I want to buy your business. They say something like, well, we've got a really good relationship. I wonder if there's any way we could expand it.
Mhm.
But something like that. And you get in a discussion. And the seller says, and should be saying, listen, I'm not sure I want to have this discussion, but here are the bad things that can happen to me if anybody knows we're having it. My customers will be told, well, you don't know who's going to own that company next. My employees will say, well, I like this boss, but I don't know who they're selling to. I'm going to leave now before a transaction happens. Um, the fact that you're selling is a huge negative. It implies instability and it introduces uncertainty into a process. I've been dealing with this company, which is a family-owned business, for 30 years. I trust them because in 30 years, they've always delivered. If it goes to a different buyer, how do I know what'll happen? And so you want confidentiality to be really high. The certainty piece is it takes anywhere from a month to 6 months to go from, I'd like to buy your business, how about $10, to what actually happens. And along the way, you've got letters of intent, and you've got lawyers involved, and you've got accountants involved, you've got CFOs involved. Somebody needs to talk to the head of sales. Every day that goes by when the seller believes that I'm going to sell my business, I'm going to get $10, I'm going to the beach, they start to desperately want the deal to close. And as time marches on and the buyer finds things and says, well, when I said $10, I didn't know that all of your customers were concentrated. There are just three of them. So I can't really pay you $10 if there are only three customers, but I can still pay you $9.50. Is that okay? Well, by that point, the person is already spending the money and spending their time on the beach. And it's okay, I really, really don't like it, but the momentum has switched to I'm selling the business.
Hmm.
The seller has relaxed. So in the certainty scheme, it's sometimes instead of doing a letter of intent, I insist, no, let's just do the full-blown agreement. I don't want to guess how it gets from a letter of intent to a full-blown agreement. Give me the full-blown agreement. Sellers in a haste do a 2-page letter of intent. Right? I mean, that's what every buyer wants. I'll pay you $10, and then it's subject to definitive agreements and customary reps and warranties and normal this and whatever my lawyer says. And that's all the document says. But you're not going to talk to anyone else for 60 days. Well, mentally, the seller has sold the business. There is no certainty. You have no idea what the deal is, as opposed to you do things that people don't like, which is I want an 8-page letter of intent. This is how you're going to pay me. This is the source of your funds. You have this money on your balance sheet. We're going to close by October 1st. Your lawyer is going to give us the documents by September 10th. We'll turn them around by September 15th. Everything is nailed down and agreed to up front. The representations and warranties will last for 2 years, and they will all be to the best of my knowledge, or whatever the standard is going to be.
Right.
You fight about it when the buyer still wants to compromise things because they want the deal. And at that point, the seller still has maximum leverage. The second the letter of intent is done, they've lost all the leverage psychologically.
Hmm.
And I say this with admiration for lawyers. To the extent anything wasn't dealt with in the specifics, even of the 8-page letter of intent, the lawyer is going to write it to be favorable to their client. That's what they're supposed to do.
Right.
The shorter the letter of intent, the more room there is for legal mischief. And those things aren't just words, and they aren't just legal things. Every word in that contract means money. It may not say money on its face, but every clause is about money.
Because you can't leave things to assumptions, I'm assuming, right?
You can't. So if you said, what is certainty? Certainty is you pay me cash at closing. Well, that's about as certain as it gets. Less certain is I'll pay you $2 down and I'll pay you another dollar in a year. Well, okay, at least I know when I'm going to get it. Except, is the dollar secured? How do I know you have it? Will I get it? Or less certain, I'll pay you $2 now, and if the business really performs, I'll pay you another dollar, sort of an earnout. Well, no, that's even less certain. So every additional step toward uncertainty works to the seller's disadvantage. So the seller's mantra is certainty and confidentiality. And certainty, by the way, also goes to, is the buyer a rookie? Have they ever done this before? Do they even know what they're promising? Are they working with lawyers they've worked with before? Have their accountants ever done a deal? People don't think about those things as certainty, but that's sort of operationally, can these people execute on their promise? And that's sort of in business generally the difference between I have a thought and I have the ability to execute it.
You also have stories in your book about, they remind me of Yogi Berra, who once said, it's not over till it's over. Talk about that.
A number of things I think sound like they are simplistic, but they're actually simple. And in their simplicity, they're elegant. So, as an example, most people would hear this and say that's a tautology, Mark, and why you're bothering. People like to do business with people they like to do business with. Okay. So, okay, well, that's kind of obvious. Well, not as obvious as you think, because now it comes down to who do people like to do business with and why do they like to do it? So, what would be the opposite? Well, do you really want to deal with somebody who doesn't return your emails promptly, doesn't return a phone call, is rude, sarcastic, doesn't respond well to your colleagues?
Even
No.
somebody who's at dinner with you and is rude to the waiter.
And that's an acid test, at least for me, for hiring people.
Right.
I want to see you interacting with normal human beings and how do you treat them? Because that's really who you are. So all of those things are true. So yes, they're sort of Yogi Berra, sort of, when you come to a fork in the road, take it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they're not profound and wise. It just means they sound simplistic, but they're simple.
Actually, one of my favorite phrases of yours, which I don't think is actually one of your maxims, but it should be, is leave the house when you were selling encyclopedias. Talk about that.
Yeah. So here's what happens. Sale of encyclopedia either happens or doesn't happen in less than an hour. I mean, that's the time frame for it. You've reached agreement, and here's how you were instructed was um, sign the contract, get the check, leave the house. Now, the sign the contract's pretty obvious because without it, you don't have anything. Get the check is pretty obvious. Why leave the house? And the answer is, and this happens to lawyers in negotiating sessions and sellers of everything, well, I've closed the deal and now we're just sitting talking. Well, I don't know how that conversation is going to go. And the longer it goes, the more likely someone's to say, wait a second, I don't really want to buy an encyclopedia. Give me my check back. If you looked at it from a risk reward analysis, which is how I look at almost everything, there is no more reward to lingering. You're not going to sell another encyclopedia. You're not going to get more money. So it's all risk. So on a risk reward ratio, you don't want to do it. You don't want to be the reason why somebody changes their mind. And the concept of seller's remorse in businesses or encyclopedia selling is very real. People made a decision, and later on, like at 3 o'clock in the morning, they're, what did I do? I'm first thing in the morning, I'm going to stop the check.
I like that. When I read that and I thought to myself, okay, it's sell the encyclopedia, leave the house. It sort of sounds like take the cannoli and leave the gun from The Godfather, something like that. I liked it. It was good. Let's talk about another maxim, and that deals with the concept of scarcity, which I think is something that people don't think a lot about. But you say that scarcity sells, and that it motivates. What's that mean?
Well, let's think of some real world examples. Um, have you ever walked by a carpet place and not seen a sign that says, going out of business, one time only, biggest bargains of your lifetime? Sale,
Sounds to me like Levin's furniture. I see that all the time on the on television.
sounds like the sign on everything,
Yeah, they're going out of business every 3 months. Right,
or continuously.
right, right.
Um, if you're a business and 25 people want to buy your business, what do you think will happen to the price compared to there are lots of businesses like yours? They could buy any one of them. If there's only one thing you can buy, it has great value. So how would you create scarcity? Well, I'm prepared to sell until Tuesday. After that, I'm in the Bahamas. So they've got time pressure and scarcity at the same time.
Hmm.
In the encyclopedia sales, it was once we get your signature on this, we move to a different neighborhood because we only give away one encyclopedia per neighborhood. That's scarcity. If you're raising money for a transaction, it's a $5 million raise. We've already, 4.7 million is already committed. There's only $300,000 left,
Hmm.
or there's less than 5% of the deal left, or there's almost nothing left. Scarcity. Okay, if you don't act now, it will be gone and you will have foregone the opportunity. And that's the sort of fear of missing out phenomenon.
Yes.
If I don't act right now, the 300,000 will go someplace else. I can't make this investment.
Fascinating. You also, I noticed in some of your stories, use time as your ally by setting deadlines. You've got some stories about that.
Why do people do anything? And it's usually because they have to. If they don't have to make a decision, they don't make a decision. So as much time as you give somebody to make a decision, they will do that. If you were in school and you got your assignment for Monday on Friday, when did you do your homework? 9:30 on Sunday night, because there was no more time. You
That's
had
true.
to do it. And until you had to do it, you didn't do it. So in businesses and in complex transactions where you have lots of people, they need a pressure to move forward. They need a reason why they have to make a decision. And sometimes uh, the deadline is natural. So lots of tax-driven transactions have to close by December 31st because otherwise it isn't in this tax year. Well, everybody knows that's a real deadline. Everybody agrees on the date. There's no argument. And so people will work towards that date. If you started on December 1st, I assure you that deal will close on December 31st. I will also tell you if it started on November 1st, it will close on December 31st. And if you started on Labor Day, it's going to close on December 31st because everybody adopts a rhythm of this is the time we have to get this task done and we will take it. And you don't have people making, why does every litigation settle on the courthouse steps, Lee?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Everyone.
Because I don't want to go to trial in the next hour.
Now there's uncertainty on both sides, and now compromises nobody would have ever made until now. Suddenly they get made because everybody can say there was no more time. We didn't have a choice. People have a real problem with compromising generally. People, non-deal makers think that when you compromise, you are compromised. Real deal makers know that no, you are not compromised by compromising. You are compromising. And those are very different phenomena and ways of thinking about it.
One of my favorite stories in your book, if you would just tell it real briefly, is when you got on a plane in the morning and immediately told them when you were leaving later that day.
This was creating a deadline. So we were simplifying the story considerably. There was a company for sale. It was a company that only a strategic buyer would purchase. It was in deep distress. And the reason only a strategic buyer would be able to purchase it is nobody else could evaluate the inventory or the quality of the receivables or the value of the customers. No private equity fund could do that in the time frame you had to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was sort of being run as a very informal auction process by a non-professional deal maker, a very good person, just not a professional at doing it, sort of an amateur. And they were doing a reasonable process of, hey, everybody tell me if you'd like to buy it and how much would you like to pay, and let's keep the discussion going. Every day that was going on, the value of the asset was decreasing because it was financially distressed. And every day you have the danger that customers leave, salespeople leave, employees leave. So literally the literal value of the asset was decreasing every day. And we've been doing that for some time. And, you sort of get used to the rhythm of deals that, everything doesn't happen in a day and a half. Other people are doing other things and there's a rhythm. But in this one, I sort of reached a point where I said to the CEO, hey, a fair amount of time has gone along here. Do you still want to buy this? Because if you don't, we should stop doing this. But I need you to rethink what you said. And frequently, what you need to ask people to do is we had an assumption, we were working it. Is the assumption still valid? And so, confronted with the question, he was almost immediate. No, unless I buy it, like in the next week or whatever it is, there's nothing there to buy. Okay, well, that was kind of a pretty clear deadline on the buy side. And now, how do you convey that to the seller in a meaningful way? And what I actually recommended is the only time I've ever done it. I don't even know why I did it or why it made sense, but it was sort of responsive to the seller's mantra. I said, these folks of all the people in the world, the confidentiality has already been blown. The whole world knows they're for sale, right? So forget that half of the mantra. Certainty, however, hasn't been blown. So what would happen if we generated every document needed to close the transaction, every document, employment agreements, releases from the bank, liens, asset purchase agreement, every single document, and send it to them and said, if you'd like to know what our deal is, here is our deal. You don't have to guess. There is no uncertainty. We'll pay you in cash at closing. Here's how the reps work. Here's how the warranties work. Here's how everything works.
You were taking a big risk by putting all that time and effort into that, right?
I wasn't, the client was.
Yeah, because he had to pay. That's right. Okay, good point. Right.
And he's asked me, and I said, listen, if the deal makes, you'll tell me I'm a genius and this was the cheapest money you ever spent. If the deal doesn't make, you'll tell me I'm an idiot. And how did you cost me all this money? I said, I'm okay with that. I agree with that. But you're the one taking the risk reward choice, not me. This is the risk reward that I see, and you can do it or not do it.
Mm-hmm.
When we sent them all the documents, we said, your process is not working, certainly not working for us. So we're prepared to come and chat with you all day. You already know what the deal is. At the end of the day, we're going home and we either have a deal or we don't. If we have a deal, great. We'll sign it and we'll close almost immediately. If we don't, we'll bow out of the bidding and you're free to go about your business. But it's one day and every decision maker has to be in that room. I don't want to hear later on we needed to talk to the patriarch or the matriarch or the every decision maker is there. And so it said in the letter that sent that I said it when we started the meeting. Remember, we're out of here at 5 o'clock. At 5:01, we're leaving to catch a plane. So
I like that.
we're done or we're not done. At noon, I reminded everybody, hey, you remember at 5 o'clock, we're done or we're not done. So set a deadline, reiterate the deadline, and most importantly, did they believe the deadline and did we mean the deadline? And the answer is yes, we meant it, and yes, they believed it.
Yeah.
And so what we created was as much certainty as anybody in that process could have created. And I pretty much just said to them repeatedly, you don't know what these other people will do. Maybe they'll do better. I don't know. Maybe they'll do worse. What you do know is we don't need bank approval. We don't need board approval. We have the cash. We can close. Here are the documents. Nobody can give you the degree of certainty that this deal will close better than us. So if you want to go for 3 birds in the bush, great. If you'd like to actually do a deal you can close, I would suggest you sign our deal.
The unconventional approach was the exact right approach, but it was a risky approach, but you were willing to take the risk.
More to the point, the client was willing to take the risk.
Right. But you convinced the client to take the risk.
Well, I offered them the opportunity to take the risk.
That's fair. That's fair. We all know that many negotiations go south because of personalities, because things get heated, because things get contentious. And you have a maxim in here that I'd like you to explain because I think it's a great way to de-escalate. And that is exploration is not a commitment. Explain that and maybe tell a story about it as well.
You're negotiating and somebody says, we want to go down path number 1. It was not in anything we had contemplated. And you say, well, I don't know. I'm not going to tell you no. What I will tell you is I'm willing to explore path number 1 with you, see how it plays out, see how you think it benefits you, identify how it hurts me. I'm perfectly willing to do the exploration as long as you understand that wandering down the path doesn't commit me to taking it at the end. And that's the critical part, is that before you wander down the path, you've said to everybody, hey, I'm flexible, definitely not clear to me that this is going to work, but I'm enough of a collaborative partner that I'm willing to explore it with you. And along the way, by the way, almost always they say something and you say, well, you realize how that helps you. Do you realize that kills me? And simply going through the exploration process by itself frequently ends a path voluntarily. By the time you've taken 10 steps, they think, whoa, this is good for me, but man, it's terrible for them. And they just say, you know what, this was very helpful. Thank you. You give people a chance to see what they're really asking, and people frequently don't know what they're asking because they know the implications to them. They don't know the implications to you. And so part of that process lets you articulate, yeah, I can see this slides you around this corner. Do you see that it pinches me around the waist until I've got a 3-inch waist? I mean,
Mhm.
can't
There's,
breathe there.
there's another aspect, though, to that maxim that I like just as much, and that is that when we're in a negotiation with someone else and they say something or they make a proposal that we disagree with, our first reaction is just to say no or to explain why we don't want it. By exploring their view, you're validating them in a way that makes them feel, I think, put it this way, you're giving credence because you're saying, I respect you as a human being. Maybe I'm not going to agree with where you want to go, but let's explore it together. That has a great way of establishing a foundation of trust as well.
Yeah, the sort of a corollary of that is saying to them, I'm guessing that I know why you want that, but I don't want to guess. Why would I guess when I could ask?
Right.
So could you tell me why do you want it and how does it help you? You would be surprised the number of times somebody's answer boils down to, well, we always get it. And
Hmm.
you say, well, that's great, but why are you even asking for it when you don't even know why you're asking for it? So when you can come back and explain to me why it's helpful to you and more helpful to you than harmful to me, I'm happy to have the discussion with you.
I
I
like
didn't
that.
say no, right? I almost never say no, Lee. I don't think no is helpful.
I
A
agree.
negotiator,
There's a rule in fundraising, as you know, I've been doing a lot of fundraising my whole life. And my rule of fundraising is no never means no. It just means not now. Right.
exactly.
Right.
And
So
no is just such a turn-off word. I mean, it's
it is.
right.
You're
People
right.
like to be told no. And even if you're going to say no, you want to say, listen, I completely understand why you'd ask for that. It's totally rational. It's completely reasonable. I'm very sorry I can't accommodate it. So unfortunately, the answer is no. But you don't ever just say no, right? You create an environment in which no is an acceptable answer, even if somebody doesn't want to hear it.
What's your favorite story from your book? You've got a lot of them, but what's the one that you enjoy talking about the most?
Well, the one that I think is simply outside almost anyone's experience is the CEO who told me that my CEO was a messenger from God.
Oh, I remember that story. Yes, yes. Okay.
And to recapitulate it briefly, I was a director and a outside lawyer for a company. It was a serial acquirer, and I mean big time serial acquirer, a sort of business model of buy, take it into the existing infrastructure, cut costs, sell more. It was a very good business model. And so it meant that we were always talking to people long before they said we're for sale. We're just talking, right? So if they ever decided to sell, they would call us first. So we'd call them just sort of meet and greet. So we were on a meet and greet. I don't know, we got there 9:30-ish, uh, Tuesday morning. This was pretty clear. And, after 2 seconds of pleasantries, the person said, your CEO is a messenger from God. And we're like, uh, our CEO is many, many things, but a messenger from God is not among them. But we didn't say that. We might have thought that. We just said, oh, that's interesting. What makes you say that? And he said that the religious leader of his organization, and by the way, his back wall was just covered with religious memorabilia from left to right. Right. So it wasn't staged. That was just his regular office. We were just having a
Mhm.
meeting. And he said, I have to go away for 2 years. I have to leave next Saturday or Sunday, whatever it was. So today is Tuesday. So if you bought my companies by the end of the day, Thursday, then I'll know that your CEO is a messenger from God. And if you don't, then he isn't. And we're like, we've never seen a financial statement. We don't know anything about your business. We know we like the products. It's Tuesday morning. This is not going to happen. But we did not say that. We said, well, let's talk. Anyway,
Mhm.
speeding it up quite a lot. We literally worked from 10 in the morning on Tuesday morning until 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. Nobody slept. Worked straight through, hired typists to come in. Turned out there were actually four companies, not one company. So it was 4 times harder than we imagined.
Hmm.
And along the way, and you have this with people of faith, that you have to consider both ends of this telescope, because I would have told you it would take a miracle and our CEO would have to be a messenger from God. So that's my end of the telescope. The other end of the telescope is we did buy the companies. And so his premise was validated. And it was a perfect reminder that the world, you don't know what the world really is. There is no real reality. And their reality may be more valid or better than yours. You don't get to judge that. But what we did was we accepted his reality and we accepted his framework all the way through the deal until the couple of points where it couldn't. We literally mechanically couldn't do what he wanted to do. And the sort of capstone, the funniest part to me was on the Wednesday night. So we've on awake for like 35 hours and it's 2 or 3 in the morning. And the EVP was just, I mean, she was stellar. I mean, she was the rock of the company and we needed to negotiate an employment agreement with her. So we started to talk and the lawyer for the seller said, well, I don't represent her. I can't represent her because I represent the seller. I said, well, you realize it's 3 o'clock in the morning. So we have to close in 9 hours. Where would you suggest we get her another lawyer? Well, I don't know, but I can't represent her. It would be unethical against the legal canon. So we're all looking at each other like nobody has any idea what to do. And then the seller said, I'll represent her. And we all said, wait a second, if anybody's got a conflict, it's you. You're the one we're paying all the money to. And by the way, you're not a lawyer.
Right.
And the EVP said, no, I trust him completely. We're in the same congregation. And so sometimes in deals, you have to have a willing suspension of disbelief. This makes no sense to me. There's no framework I can look at this through. I don't want to think about this a week from now and in the cold light of day, think about how crazy this is. We said, great. And I said, well, but if you're not represented by a lawyer, I can't represent my client. So our outside accountant will represent. We have the seller and our outside accountant negotiating the employment agreement. And your head is just spinning. But they actually both did a pretty good job and we got it done. But that was one of the rare moments where there's no place to go here. And anyway, you get things like that all the time in deals. And sometimes just shutting your mouth and seeing if something will evolve is the best thing you can do. And I don't think we consciously did that. We did that because we were brain dead and too tired to think, but the solution emerged. And sometimes you just have to let things unveil themselves. And this was one of those, you can't force it. Actually, Mark, you're not smart enough to think it through. Let life evolve. See what happens.
It's also a good example that when you think there's nowhere to go, actually there is. You just have to think out of the box and be unconventional, which is what you did.
You have to try to pretend that there is no box.
Yes.
Not that it's time to think out of it.
Mm-hmm.
The rules, and I'm not good at them. I don't. So a strength and a weakness is I don't see boundaries other people see.
Okay.
So sometimes I'll be floating around at 40,000 feet and I'll come down very excitedly to Amy and say, hey, and she'll say, Mark, you're going from like mountaintop to mountaintop. You understand you've got to go down a hill and there's a river, then you got to go up another hill and then down a hill and there's no bridge. No, I didn't see any of that. That's a strength. It's also a weakness.
I would argue it's more of a strength, and that's why Jerry Garcia was such a great musician and why you've been a great lawyer. So my final couple of questions have to do with why should someone buy this book and read it if they're not a deal maker, if they're not in business, if they're not in mergers and acquisitions? Because if I'm a business person and I see that title, I'm definitely buying that book. That's a no-brainer. But what about people who don't do that for a living? What should they read this book as well?
Yeah, sort of to my surprise and pleasure, it turns out they should. And I had everybody from third grade teachers to biology students to tell me how surprised they were when they read it. And part of it is that although a lot of the maxims come from the cauldron of deal making, like an expectation unarticulated is a disappointment guaranteed, those are universal. How human beings think and how you influence them, how you tell stories lead to sort of your earlier point,
Right.
how you communicate, what empathy means. All of those are just sort of intrinsic to the human condition. No matter what your workplace is, you're still a human being. And by the way, those things are all impacting you, even if you don't want to know about them and impact others that way. You are subject to all of those things. And people frequently say, I never thought about the going out of business stuff. People said, I almost always go in. I never thought about why I almost go in. Have you ever watched late night TV and this is an exclusive offer only available for one day on TV, exclusive? I think exclusive, it's going out to 100 million people. They're going to run the same ad the next 14 weeks,
Right.
and you're still going to think it's exclusive and it's scarce. So it makes people think about things they haven't thought about. And hopefully most of them laugh along the way, which was one of
Well, I went into reading the book thinking that it was just for lawyers or entrepreneurs or business people who are in the process or in the business of negotiating and deal making. But when I was finished with the book, I thought it was as much about leadership and communication as it was anything else, which transcends the boundaries of business and law and entrepreneurship, which is why I do encourage people to buy this book, even if they're not in a business setting, because I think there are lots of lessons that apply to it. And my final question to you is, what are this is something you mentioned at the very beginning of the interview, but I want to give you an opportunity to say it again, perhaps in a different way. And that is the most important takeaways from this book. You've got a takeaway after every chapter, but we don't have time for all those takeaways. So you've got to not only, you have takeaways in every chapter, but now I'm asking you to summarize those takeaways into just a few.
God gave you one mouth and two ears. The ratio wasn't an accident. You don't learn anything when you're talking. You learn a lot of things when you're listening. You learn more things when you're listening if you're trying to listen for what do I agree with instead of what do I disagree with. That's intrinsic to building anything in the world, including human relationships. And that is an attitude toward life, which is I'm trying to listen, to engage, to build, to understand, and communicate.
That's great. Well, you summarized it too quickly. I thought you were going to give me a couple. That was actually very succinct. So I'll give you one. You can do another takeaway if you'd like.
I'll tell you the title that the title should have been
Okay, please do.
Because I told you why it is what it is.
Yeah.
What it should have been is the soul of the deal, the EQ of M&A. Because as all the readers have pointed out to me, every other book on deals is about structure or taxes or technical stuff. Yours is the only one that's really approaching all of this from the standpoint of emotional intelligence. And my students I taught that course at Berkeley called Street Smart Startups, which I have to say very slowly, Street Smart Startups. But they asked me what the commonality was of CEOs and leaders of any organization. And I said, they're not always the person with the highest IQ. They are almost always the person with the highest EQ, because you can't lead if you don't have that emotional intelligence.
It's all about empathy, active listening, listening to engage and not just listening to respond. How many of us listen to an argument and we're really not listening. We're just waiting to respond and tell that person why they're wrong. And that's not what you talk about in your book. It's about listening to engage and to actually perhaps modify your views or modify your approach based upon what that other person said. That's a great lesson.
Yeah. And I can't remember who said it, but it was an author, and her comment was, most dialogues are just monologues committed in the presence of another.
I like that. I like that. Well, Marc, you've written a great book. I recommend it to lots of people, not just those who are in M&A or business or entrepreneurship or the law, but to anybody who wants to learn how to lead, who wants to learn how to more effectively communicate. And I actually think that the title should have been one of your maximums, and that is people are the epicenter of every deal. I think that was my favorite one. It may seem obvious, but in the end, that's actually, to me, the core of what you said, because your title still had M&A in it. And I think that's too narrow. I think it should be broader and talk about the fact that this transcends even M&A. But having said that, we'll end on that note of polite disagreement and in terms of what this book should have been titled, but we don't disagree on the value of its contents. So Marc Morgenstern, thanks very much for spending the time. say hello to Amy.
Yeah.
And I can't wait for everyone else to see and to watch this, but more importantly, to buy the book, The Soul of the Deal. Thanks again.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Good to see you.
Bye-bye.